where I am speaking to you right now, is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, the two large, broad Indigenous groups that are also recognized as the traditional caretakers of the land that Queen's University is on. When I make a land acknowledgement, I do different things with it. Sometimes I use it as an opportunity to talk about a little bit more about the history. Sometimes I use it to talk about more about the reality and maybe my position within that reality. So I'm not Indigenous, I'm a settler. What does that mean? And sometimes I use it to talk about the land itself and to recognize and honor the land itself in a way that's authentic to who I am as a settler, Canadian, as an individual, but also something that I've been learning about from Indigenous colleagues and friends over the years. And today I think I find myself more in the simple recognition, standing in my own house, speaking to you remotely, not really knowing where any of you are or the histories of your land. This kind of environment, this virtual or online environment, really reminds me how disconnected we can all become from the physical reality of where we are, but how being attentive to and mindful to that physical reality is really important. And it's important not just because of maybe wanting to have personal health and well-being, but also for the health and well-being of the land itself and for all of the beings that interact and intersect with the land. And I think that kind of awareness of or situatedness is really important in the decolonization and indigenization work that I've been doing. So that's kind of where I find myself today. Next slide, please. So here's a quick session overview. Today, Karalyn and I are going to be doing a little bit of back and forth with you. Karalyn is going to talk briefly about within this sort of overall framework of giving constructive feedback on writing. Karalyn will talk about writing across the disciplines because often people think about writing as being something only that English majors do or that people in the humanities do. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'll dive into some specific methods for giving feedback. From there, we'll move to a breakout group activity where in smaller groups, you'll be able to actually practice giving some feedback and see, apply a little bit some of the ideas from the workshop. And then right at the end, we'll have some time for questions. I should say just before Karalyn moves on to that for those of you who've ever attended my Writing Pedagogy Institute, which I often do in May, some of this may seem a little bit familiar, or maybe it will be new and interesting and you all have forgotten some of this. But I hope in any case that you're able to gain something from this and from maybe re-engaging with some ideas that blew by you the first time around. Okay, Karalyn, over to you.
All right, so I'm coming in now to talk about writing across the disciplines, and this will be a short little section, but really I think it's about recognizing that there is writing in all disciplines. It just might not come in the form that we traditionally think of as that kind of English or humanities essay or arts essay. And I'm someone that comes from a science background, and it took me a long time to realize that writing was a critical part of my discipline and of my profession. So I want us to all kind of take a moment to reflect on our own context and our own discipline, and to think about where do you write, or what does writing look like within your discipline? And you can jot down a note if you've got a paper and pen handy, or just try and think about what that writing looks like within your field. So as everyone's had a moment to kind of think and reflect upon their own discipline and what writing looks like for them, I think something that's important to acknowledge at this point is that everything that we present moving forward in the presentation are really principles that apply across the disciplines. And that even though the writing conventions and writing types of assignments might look different across the disciplines, it's really providing feedback on writing is something that is going to happen in all disciplines, and that these principles will apply regardless of which discipline you come from.
All right, so next slide, please, Sandra. So another question for you to think about, and this time I'll actually ask you to put some ideas right into the chat. So what we're interested in hearing about here is, why might you even give feedback in the first place? So any ideas, however ill-formed, can go into the chat. And this is kind of as an aside, I don't know if you thought about Zoom group chat sessions as a place where you're writing in your discipline, but this would be an example of writing. And this is an example of students, or in your case, participants in a workshop, doing writing as part of this course or this workshop. So typing in the chat counts as writing. All right, so I'm seeing Sean has written that he maybe gives feedback for purposes of improvement. Other thoughts? Jordan, along a similar line, to help others improve their communication or clarifying their ideas, concisely describing something, clarity of communication, providing a different perspective. Bren saying encouragement. Natasha helping students see their strong or weaker points. And then as a possibility of leading to discussion, learning goes both ways. Eduardo pointing out to justify a mark we assign. Absolutely. So feel free, if you're still typing stuff, keep sticking it in there. If we go to the next slide, Bren adding to promote learning and dialogue. Some possible reasons for giving feedback. One can be for learning, and I liked the idea that Sarah shared about that learning can go both ways. So maybe the feedback is for learning on the part of the instructor or the TA. Maybe the feedback, I think most typically people think of feedback as meant for learning in terms of the student and their perspectives. We might think of feedback being used for future revisions. So here's some feedback on a draft, now apply it in the final version. Certainly justifying a grade is a lot of the purpose of a lot of feedback, as some people mentioned in the chat. And then there's a couple of here versus, which is, different sort of buzzwords. One is the idea of feedback versus feed forward. So which you see in a lot of writing pedagogy literature, a notion of, are we talking about feedback as a way to encourage students to reflect on work that they've now completed and that's over? Or are we using the feedback to help encourage future learning and growth among students? So, and that might be within the scope of a course, say, a draft version or an outline versus a final version. But it could also be that the feed forward is meant to carry forwards into, say, the next course in a sequence, or into, if we had, this was your first try in first year engineering at writing a project, and then in fourth year, you're coming back and writing projects again, or you're doing it throughout your degree, you want to get that feed forward idea of, oh, what I learned in this course connects to the next thing that I'm doing. So that sense of forward directed or revision oriented feedback, it's often called. And then also these two really common words in education literature are formative and summative. Formative feedback is usually given during the process of completing something or putting together a particular assignment or assessment piece, whereas summative feedback is feedback given on an end product that's often connected to a grade, but not necessarily, but that's the point of sort of making a final judgment on a finished work, versus formative, which is more about helping a learner through the process. So all of these are different reasons. And I think even just reflecting on what's the purpose of the feedback is a great place to start when you're thinking about giving your own feedback. Being clear about why you're doing it is part of giving effective feedback. In terms of specific strategies, moving to the next slide, I'm going to give you a few different ideas about some different strategies, but this kind of lists them all. So first, admitting you're not an expert, asking for help, setting priorities, deciding on HOCs or LOCs, which I'll elaborate on momentarily, considering your feedback style, and then finally practicing. Just as learners are learning, the learners you may be interacting with as an instructor, as a teaching assistant, they're learning, but also you're learning, and giving feedback giving effective feedback takes practice. So the more that you do it and reflect on your own abilities, seeking feedback on your feedback, as it were, the more you'll find that you are able to give that effective feedback that your students are looking for. All right, so let's start with the first one, admitting you're not an expert and asking for help. So I think this one, if you could move to the next slide, Sandra, this one's really important, especially in academia, because I think as you're doing graduate studies and moving into, say, a tenure track position, or even as an adjunct lecturer or someone in a different kind of career path, you're still expected to be an expert in your field, in your discipline, in your subdiscipline. The whole point of this PhD journey for many people, or doctoral studies, is to say that I'm the expert in this tiny thing and I know more about it than anyone else in the world. And so when you have to now become a writing instructor, writing is not a place where everyone has expertise, and certainly doctoral studies and training doesn't necessarily lend itself to allowing graduate students or even full professionals who are, have been, I can think of full professors who don't have expertise in writing instruction, but have a lot of expertise in another area. So kind of bursting that bubble for yourself and admitting that you're not an expert can be really hard within an academic setting where expertise is valued above a lot of other things. But doing that and then asking for help is a really important step. Figuring out, what do you know, what do you not know? Maybe you really actually do have a sense of what the standard writing practices for a particular type of writing in your discipline are, because you've written piles of reports over your career, or piles of public policy statements, or whatever it is that you write a lot of. And so you do have expertise there, but spelling, not your strong suit, or grammar, I don't really even know how to explain what's wrong with that sentence. So asking for help in those cases. And I think that's really where Student Academic Success Services at Queen's is an excellent resource. They, for those who've been around for a while, they have SAS, as they're affectionately known, have writing as part of the academics supports that they offer to students. And it's one of the main things that students will visit SAS to get help with, or to improve their skills in. And they've also got a whole pile of online resources as well. So they're happy to work with instructors in terms of designing in-class activities, or different things in terms of helping students get writing instruction that's tailored to a specific assignment. But then they also have lots of online resources around all the ins and outs of grammar and those kinds of things. So it's a really great resource once you've admitted that you're not the expert necessarily. So that's the first step. Moving on to the next slide, we can talk about setting priorities. So here I think we can think about the level of detail that's required with your feedback and what to focus on. So again, thinking back to what's the purpose of the feedback that you're giving. But there's a number of different ways that you can start to set those priorities. First of all is to thinking about what students are expected to learn through a particular assignment. Maybe there are specific learning outcomes relating to this particular assignment that you can focus your feedback upon. Maybe the course has a specific learning outcome relating to writing, being able to articulate contrary positions in an argumentative fashion or something like that. And so then you can say, okay, well, I'm going to focus my feedback mostly on that aspect of learning and not on other ones. Another way to focus your priorities might be to pay attention to the rubric itself. So if the assignment has a rubric, really being careful to only comment on the things that are in the rubric and to leave aside the other things. You might also consider the way that students will use the feedback. So I think one classic example is as a graduate student or an instructor who spends years, a long time on the final essay that students have submitted during the final exam period. They carefully mark up every spelling mistake, and they indicate all of the different errors in sentence structure, and they talk about why the argument is missing and all these sorts of things. And then students never pick up their final essays. So you've spent all this time providing feedback that students don't even read because they don't come back for that final essay. So thinking about how will students apply the feedback, what kind of feedback are they expecting to receive, and where will they use it again? That can also prioritize what you talk about in your own feedback. And then finally thinking about what the students need feedback on. And this relates back to the idea of the rubric itself and what its focus is. But, you know, what's the purpose of this assignment? Is it do students really need feedback on the content? Do they need feedback on the writing, the mechanics of it? Or do they need it on both? And maybe that varies between individual students as you read through their work. Maybe you find that on a particular assignment, you want to focus on one, and on another assignment, you focus on another. But just being aware of that difference between talking about, say, how a student is writing up the methodology in their lab report versus the sentence structure within that methodology section. Those are kind of different things. Or the clarity of the communication of the methodology versus, you said that you were going to use a Bunsen burner, and then and then later on you don't say Bunsen burner at all, or the Bunsen burner, no one uses Bunsen burners anymore, Robin, because you did it when you were in high school 20 years ago. You know, so making sure what it is that you want to help students with your learning in the feedback that you provide. All right, so next slide. This is kind of, again, getting more at that difference between mechanics and content. So the HOCs and the LOCs stand for higher order concerns and lower order concerns. And you'll see, I really like this particular slide because the graphics here are communicating the difference between these two things. So you can see higher order concerns are where you're able to see this whole field full of beautiful flowers because you're at a higher level and you might be talking about those higher level things, versus lower order concerns where you're getting down to the fine grain of an individual flower within that field. So if you think about that difference, what does that translate to? Well, if we see the next slide, to talk about lower order concerns, that's things like sentence structure, punctuation, word choice, spelling. Those are all kind of mechanics, writing mechanics issues. Whereas on the next slide, looking at higher order concerns, those are things like the thesis or the focus, the audience and the purpose, the organization of the writing piece overall, the argument development, or the way that communication happens. And I think often one of the big pitfalls that folks fall into when they're giving feedback on writing is that, especially those who are really good about grammar or have their own particular pet peeves around, oh, I hate it when people use the wrong its, when they use the apostrophe when they shouldn't have, or things like that. They can it's easy to get bogged down in those details of the lower order concerns and then spend a lot of time providing feedback on that. And then as a result, miss some of the higher order concerns around the overall structure of the piece, the disciplinary conventions that it's meant to be articulating, that the student is still learning. And often I think those are the places, those higher order concerns, the disciplinary conventions, the overall structure and format, the audience, the purpose, how it's communicating on that larger scale level. That's where most instructors have more expertise. And it's often the lower order concerns where people feel a bit like, well, I don't really know what the rules are around commas. So I think typically what writing pedagogy researchers recommend, and what I think I would stand by, is to really try to focus your attention in feedback on the higher order concerns and to leave the lower order concerns as kind of an aside. For instance, if you scan through a piece of work and you notice, wow, this person has a lot of trouble with commas, then maybe point out the first one or two and mention that in a single comment, rather than going through and indicating all of those lower order concerns throughout the entire piece of writing. Stick to the higher order stuff, because that's where really I think the value of you as an individual trained in that discipline is the most effective. And I think I'll leave it at that with this one. The only other thing to mention is to think about, as we see more and more English as an additional language learners in a predominantly English university, or in a university where English is the primary language of instruction, I think it's important to remember that the specific lower and higher order concerns that you'll see amongst students might differ from student to student. So I think you might have to think about, well, what is the most common thing that I'm seeing here? Is there another common thing amongst a core group of students that might be different? And certainly SAS is a really great resource for providing more expertise about those in English as an additional language learners and the kind of supports that you can give them as you're teaching as well. So I see a comment from Jordan asking about whether to focus on higher order or lower order, and maybe that lower order concerns would become more important if you were providing feedback on a manuscript. And I think absolutely, I mean, that gets back to, it seems to me that you're thinking about, well, what's the purpose of my feedback here? And if you are, say, a dissertation supervisor, and the purpose of the feedback on the final draft before submission is to make sure it's absolutely solid, then you are going to get into some of those lower order things. But again, even then you might say, wow, you know, I noticed a couple typos here and there. I circled the ones that I saw, but you need to find the rest. You can be strategic with how much you do in order to give the student a chance to learn that skill for themselves as well.
Can I jump in here quickly, Robin?
Sure.
So I was going to say, I see a lot of that kind of lower order concern also come up when I do like lab report feedback for a lot of my students, where they'll have like calculations errors, and I won't want to point out every single calculation error that they have. So I often do like a little bit of short form notation as well, that students know what to expect with my feedback, and that often they'll just see like a little like a circle or a symbol that I'll put in that indicates to them that, you know, that's something that they should look for in the rest of their calculations, without me having to go through and like annotate every single kind of one of those, but just to point them in, hey, go back and check your math on this. So I think in a lot of the scientific writing as well, you'll see kind of that discrimination of pointing out some of the lower order concerns.
Awesome, thanks, Karalyn. All right, so if we move on to the next slide. Here I'm talking about feedback style. And I think when we were talking I had you post in the chat some ideas about what the purpose of feedback might be. Some of the purposes that were shared started to get at the differences in feedback style. I think that the three sort of sub issues here, one are around the idea of a style that coaches rather than criticizes. And then thinking about the amount of feedback that's given, and considering the format that it's given in. So all three of these things, your tone, the amount, and the format, all impact your overall feedback style. So if we could look at the next slide. Here's an example of criticizing and coaching. So criticizing is, this section is poorly done, which is a pretty blunt statement. Nothing wrong with blunt statements, and certainly I think there's different cultural conventions and approaches to the way that feedback is given. So I want to be aware that for some cultures, that first sentence might be fine. For others, that might be quite rude, and that's part of navigating a multicultural classroom and navigating an inclusive classroom and making that space inclusive. That said, I think the second example, your weakest section is this one, and the 3 ways you could improve it is a much more helpful comment in terms of more on the coaching end of things. It's coaching a student towards being able to actually make differences or improvements in their work. Similarly, if you look at the next slide, needs more in itself is maybe not a criticism per se, but is certainly quite brief, and doesn't give me as a student very much information about what I need to do to improve. Whereas the other side is very specific in terms of the different ways that the paper might be improved in this case. So if you think about, if you've ever done any kind of physical activity or participated in a sport, there might well be moments when you want that person yelling at you to just do 5 more push-ups. But I think often the more effective thing is to say, like, you did it, just do 4 more, you're almost done, way to go. And you're struggling at your push-ups because your arms are out to the sides instead of beside you. And then you go, oh, wow, that makes it so much easier. Thanks for telling me that. So this is the kind of strategy that I'm hoping you take away in terms of adapting your feedback to be more coaching rather than criticizing. Thinking about specificity, though, this is where we get into the amount of feedback. So if I could see the next slide, this is an example of some feedback on an essay. I can't even read that to you because I get bored after about the third line. And as a student, I can tell you there are not that many students that are going to take the time to read through this much feedback. So really thinking about how you frame that feedback. Let's look at the next slide, and you can see another example of some overwhelming feedback. This person's chosen to use the comment feature in Word, which is great, really helpful, sometimes a nice strategy. But pretty much every sentence, if not every word, has a comment. And now I'm overwhelmed as a student by all of the pink and wondering, like, which of these things is the most important? Which do we want to do? And I see Attas' comment about that we can't always give the thorough feedback because we don't have the hours for it. Absolutely. So not only is this kind of feedback, I mean, you can see even the next slide, here's another one, here's a huge rubric with all sorts of stuff in it and some stuff highlighted, but I don't really know what the highlighting means. So not only do you not have time to give this feedback, whether you're a TA on a limited number of hours or an instructor who also has limitations on their hours, maybe because of work-life balance issues, or because you're also trying to complete your dissertation, or you're trying to raise a family, or you're trying to work 5 different adjunct positions because of the poor current work conditions in universities, or, you know, pandemic, like that could be a thing. So so time becomes also an issue when you're giving such thorough feedback. So keeping in mind the impact that the feedback has on learners, but also your own time as an instructor as well. Okay, final point about feedback style is to think about the format. So even within that quick little slide, you saw one that was more of a paragraph style, one that used in-text comments in Word, and one that used the rubric itself as a way of giving feedback. So those are all possibilities. If you use OnCue, or your course that you're TAing for uses OnCue, certainly there's different ways of giving feedback within there, attaching it to a rubric, having some small comments attached to the assignment itself when it's submitted, things like that. But you might also think about whether you want to give the feedback in person, or in a live setting, or in a synchronous setting, or recorded. So maybe you actually just want to talk through and make a little recording for each student. Often that's easier and more effective way for some people to give the feedback and for others to learn. Thinking about summary comments. So in the example that I showed you with some stuff in a rubric that was highlighted, I think what it would have improved that feedback is just having a couple of sentences that say, overall, this is what was good and this is what needed improvement. So that kind of quick summary rather than the page-long summary can often be effective. Thinking about in-text comments and whether that's helpful. And then again, voice recording or a rubric or a form, something like that. So thinking about the format, what's going to be the most effective for you? What's going to be the most effective for your learners? And the answers to those questions will change depending on the assignment, depending on your own issues and interests, depending on your students' interests and abilities. But to think about it is really the point that I'm getting at here. Okay, so that's quite a lot of information at this point. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to make you write just for a little bit, just to think about taking in all of that information. Write for 1 minute about how you might describe your current feedback style, or if you've never actually given feedback before, maybe the style you would be likely to use. What would you expect to do if you were giving feedback? So take a minute to write about that now. Okay, that's just about a minute. So that's really kind of the core of the workshop in terms of the information that we want to share. But Karalyn and I wanted to give you a chance to actually apply some of the ideas that we've shared with you. And so Karalyn will now introduce the kind of breakout room portion of the workshop and lead you through what you need to do next.
All right, so if we can take a look at the next slide, there should be, perfect. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out into 3 different rooms and have a chance to independently read a sample kind of piece of work. They're all fairly short little chunks of text. And once you've had the chance to read that piece of work, we're going to ask you to apply kind of your current feedback style and to think about one area that you would give feedback to that particular student. Then what we'd like you to do is there is a rubric attached after the piece of writing. Take a look at the rubric and see if your feedback aligns with what is emphasized within that rubric. Then come together as a group and discuss kind of where you gave feedback and the feedback style. And we want you to be able to come back after about 15 minutes in the breakout room and be able to report back on what you discovered about how you and your peers gave feedback on this particular piece of writing. So what I'm going to do now is in the chat, I'm going to add 3 different links. I'll make sure everyone is able to see these. And they're not going in as links. All right, attempt number 2. Okay, let's see if these ones go in as links. Perfect. Okay, so what you'll do is you'll want to select one of the 3 breakout rooms, and we've broken them up based on a disciplinary topic. However, please don't worry if your disciplinary topic is not there. The principles of providing feedback on the writing sample are the same. We just have kind of a variety of different writing samples for you to choose. And then we're going to open up the breakout rooms, and you should get an option to pick which one you'd like to join. So open up the Google Doc associated with that breakout room to see the sample piece of writing. And now you should be invited to join a breakout room. And we'll come back together in the main room in about 15 minutes.
And Karalyn and I will give you plenty of warning for that 15-minute time's up as well.
So I'm seeing the first few people are successfully getting into breakout rooms. Please just let us know if you have any trouble moving into a breakout room.
Do you want me to leave the slides up?
Once folks are in a breakout room, they won't be able to see the slides.
Yeah, I think we can take down the slides and stop the recording
Okay.
now.
For those of you that can't see the request for the breakout room, that's fine. It's probably just because you're using an older version of Zoom. If you put in the chat or just let me know, like turn on your mic and let me know which room you'd like to go to, I can put you into that room. Jordan. Okay, Megan's going to group A. C, Janet, room C. Here we go. Natasha going to room C. Allison, if you need help moving into a breakout room, please just let me know which one you'd like to go to, and I will make sure you can get into it.
When folks are in the breakout room, they're able to still chat in the main room. Is that right?
Yes, they can do the chat to everyone in the main room, but we can't individually chat with any of them,
Okay.
which is weird. Right now, everyone's in the breakout room. Though I just moved Allison. She direct messaged me saying she was already reading the engineering sample, so I popped her into the engineering room.
Great.
So everyone's in a breakout room.
All right. And can you stop the recording?
Yes.